Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture a desert, what really comes to mind?
Hmm.
For most of us, I think it's those classic images. Endless shimmering sand dunes stretching to the horizon,
Right, yes.
sand beating down relentlessly, maybe that iconic silhouette of a camel train against a fiery sunset. It just feels like a place devoid of life, really, just heat and dust.
That's the common picture, absolutely.
But what if that picture is, like, drastically incomplete? What if I told you that some deserts actually regularly experience freezing temperatures, even snow?
It happens. Definitely challenges the stereotype.
Or that these places, far from being empty, are actually home to some of the most incredible, resilient life forms on the planet,
Hmm.
including us, humans, who found these really ingenious ways to survive there for thousands of years.
It's true that conventional image of a desert as just, a vast uniform sea of sand, it's a pretty significant
So
oversimplification.
sand isn't the main thing.
Not fundamentally. While sandy areas exist, of course, deserts are defined primarily by their extreme lack of precipitation.
Okay. Lack of rain.
Exactly. The threshold is usually set at getting less than, say, 10 inches, or about 25 centimeters of rainfall a year.
Right.
But within that simple definition, there's just this world of astonishing diversity. You've got intensely hot, low-latitude regions near the equator, and then you have surprisingly cold, high-altitude or mid-latitude plateau, often far inland.
And that complexity, that sort of hidden diversity, that's what we're diving into today.
Hmm.
We've taken a deep look into a classic geography text chapter,
Hmm.
the kind of source that boils down dense info into clear concepts to pull out the absolute essential knowledge about these fascinating and often really misunderstood environments.
Yeah, our mission in this deep dive is to go beyond that stereotype. We want to understand exactly where these arid and semi-arid regions are spread across the globe
Okay.
and the specific climatic forces that make them so dry and also give them those dramatic temperature swings.
Right, the heat and cold.
And how life, plants, animals, including us, has managed not just to survive, but to actually adapt, to even thrive in these conditions.
And the different ways people have lived there.
Exactly, the remarkable spectrum of ways different human societies have actually made a home in deserts.
Think of this as your accelerated path to being genuinely well-informed about deserts. By the end of this chat, you won't just know what a desert is, but why it is the way it is.
Hopefully armed with some surprising facts.
Yeah, facts that'll make you see these environments in a completely new light.
Mhm.
So let's start at the beginning of the big picture. Where on Earth do we actually find these dry places? What dictates their location?
Well, the distribution isn't random at all. It's really closely tied to global atmospheric circulation patterns and geographical
Well,
features.
big mountains and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But as we said, the defining thing is that very low annual precipitation, typically below 10 inches. And we basically categorize them into two main types based on location and the resulting temperatures. The hot deserts, sometimes called low-latitude deserts, found closer to the equator, and the mid-latitude deserts, located further north or south.
And understanding why they're dry is the key to knowing where they are, right? It's not just random bad luck with rain clouds.
Absolutely not. There are these fundamental, large-scale climate mechanisms going on. One of the primary causes, especially for those really big hot deserts, is their location under the subtropical high-pressure belts.
Subtropical high pressure belts. Okay.
Yeah, these belts circle the Earth around roughly 15 degrees to 30 degrees north and south latitudes. In these zones, huge amounts of air from the equator and higher latitudes meet up in the upper atmosphere and then start to sink. They descend. We call it subsidence.
So air is actually sinking down towards the surface in these areas.
Precisely. And as air sinks, it gets compressed and warms up. It's a process called adiabatic heating.
Ah, right.
Warmer air can hold more moisture, so its relative humidity drops significantly. This descending warming air creates incredibly stable atmospheric conditions,
Stable meaning.
meaning clouds just really struggle to form. Any moisture that might be near the ground gets evaporated quickly by that dry, sinking air. It's like having a permanent lid on the atmosphere that stops any upward movement needed for clouds and rain.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. No rising air, no condensation, no rain. Simple as that almost.
Pretty much.
So if you look at a world map, where do these subtropical high-pressure belts put the main hot deserts?
Most of the world's biggest hot deserts sit right within these belts, between 15 degrees and 30 degrees north and south. And a key geographical pattern you'll notice is they are often on the western coasts of continents.
Western coasts. Why there specifically?
Well, it's partly due to the influence of offshore trade winds. In the subtropics, the main winds, the trade winds, blow from east to west. So, on the western side of continents, these winds often blow parallel to the coast or even slightly away from it.
Oh, I see. So they carry any moisture out to sea instead of bringing it onto the land.
Exactly. So you've got the sinking dry air from above and winds pushing moisture away from the coast. It's a really potent combination for creating dryness.
A double whammy.
Pretty much. That western coastal location within the subtropical high-pressure belts is a classic recipe for a hot desert. And the scale of some of these deserts is just immense.
The Sahara is the one everyone thinks of first, obviously.
And for good reason. The Sahara Desert in North Africa is the single largest stretch of hot desert on Earth. It goes about 3,200 miles from east to west.
Wow.
And its total area is staggering around 3.5 million square miles.
3.5 million. That's huge.
To give you some perspective, the source points out that this is actually larger than the entire contiguous United States, all 48 states, or even all 50 states combined.
Bigger than the whole U.S. That's almost unbelievable.
It's an almost incomprehensible expanse of dryness, really drives home how dominant this type of environment is in certain parts of the world.
Okay, what's the next biggest after the Sahara?
That would be the Great Australian Desert. It covers a huge chunk, almost half of the continent of Australia.
Half of Australia.
Yeah. And then there are other significant hot deserts in these belts. You've got the Arabian Desert in the Middle East, the Thar Desert in northwestern India and Pakistan,
Okay.
the Kalahari and Namib deserts down in southern Africa, and in North America, places like the Mojave, the Sonoran, the Californian deserts, and large parts of the Mexican deserts are all examples of these subtropical, hot, arid lands.
Got it. So those are the hot ones, largely shaped by that sinking air
Yeah.
and often those coastal wind patterns. Where do the mid-latitude deserts fit into this global puzzle? They're often colder, you mentioned.
They are different, yeah. Their dryness is often caused by different factors, and their temperature patterns are quite distinct. Mid-latitude deserts are typically found much further inland,
Okay, inland.
often in the interiors of large continents, or maybe on elevated plateau. They're located well away from the main sources of ocean moisture, and aren't necessarily defined by those subtropical high-pressure belts, though some might be on the poleward edge of their influence.
So being far from the ocean is key. The air just loses its moisture before it gets there.
That's a major factor. We call it the continental effect. Air masses traveling inland from the coast gradually drop their moisture as rain along the way. By the time they reach the deep interior of a continent, they're relatively dry. Simple as that sometimes.
Okay.
But another really crucial cause for some mid-latitude deserts is the rain shadow effect.
Ah, I think I've heard of that. Is that where mountains block the rain?
Exactly. Major mountain ranges act like barriers to rain-bearing winds. As moist air is forced to rise up over the mountains, it cools, condenses, and drops most of its rain or snow on the windward side facing the wind. By the time the air comes down on the leeward side, the side in the mountain's shadow, it's dry. And it warms up again as it descends, that adiabatic heating again, creating arid conditions.
So the mountains literally cast a shadow of dryness behind them.
That's a good way to put it.
What are some examples of these inland or rain shadow deserts?
Well, key examples of large mid-latitude deserts include the massive Gobi Desert in Central Asia. That's a prime example of a continental interior desert, just miles and miles from the sea.
Okay, the Gobi.
The Turkestan Desert, also in Central Asia, fits this category too. And then in South America, the Patagonian Desert is a perfect illustration of the rain shadow effect.
Patagonia. How do the Andes create that desert?
Well, you have the huge Andes Mountains running all along the western edge of South America.
Right, very high.
Very high. Moisture-laden winds come in from the Pacific Ocean from the west. They hit the Andes or force upwards and dump all their rain and snow on that narrow strip of land west of the mountains, like in southern Chile.
So the western side gets the rain.
Yeah. Then the air flows over the peaks and descends onto the vast plateau of Patagonia on the eastern side. By then, it's extremely dry, and that creates the extensive Patagonian desert in the rain shadow.
Fascinating.
The source even points out some of the absolute most extreme examples of dryness on the planet, places getting less than half an inch of rain a year. The Atacama and Peruvian deserts along the west coast of South America.
Yeah, Atacama, right.
These are technically under the subtropical high, but their extreme dryness is really amplified by the influence of a cold ocean current flowing along the coast there.
Okay, so there's a lot going on climatically. It's not just dry. It's how it's dry, why it's dry, and then there's the temperature extremes too. Let's really unpack that climate story.
Absolutely. That defining feature is the very low annual precipitation, consistently less than 10 inches. But, the numbers themselves only start to tell the story of how truly dry these places can be.
The source gives some pretty stark examples, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It paints a picture of just how little water actually reaches these landscapes. William Creek in Australia, right in the Great Australian Desert, averages only about 5.4 inches of rain per year.
5 inches. That's not much.
Not much at all. Kota in India's Thar Desert gets just 4 inches. Yuma, Arizona, smack in the middle of the Sonoran Desert in the U.S., gets a mere 3.5 inches annually.
3.5 inches for a whole year.
Yeah. And then, like we touched on, places like the Atacama in South America or certain coastal areas in Africa influenced by cold currents, they practically receive no measurable rain at all some years.
And that Atacama example it gives is just,
Yeah.
it's mind-boggling. It sounds like something from another planet.
It really is a remarkable illustration of extreme dryness and, crucially, unpredictability. In one part of the Atacama, the source says only 0.02 inches of rain reportedly fell over a 17-year period.
17 years. 0.02 inches.
And that tiny amount was spread across just 3 light showers during that entire time. I mean, think about that, almost 2 decades with barely a drop.
Unbelievable.
And then another station, 150 miles away, recorded 0 rainfall for 4 straight years. And then, bam! Totally unexpectedly, it received a torrential downpour of 2.5 inches in just one afternoon.
4 years of nothing, then a flash flood. 17 years just to sprinkle. That's not just low rainfall. It's completely unreliable, chaotic precipitation. What does that unpredictability even mean for anything trying to live there?
It means life has to be incredibly opportunistic or just incredibly resilient. Plants and animals, they can't rely on regular water. They have to either grab the chance when rain does fall, like instantly, or develop amazing ways to store water or just survive these massive long droughts.
And we talk about why it's so dry fundamentally about the atmosphere.
Yeah, primarily lying under those subtropical high-pressure belts where the air is sinking and warming adiabatically.
Right, the sinking air.
That suppresses convection, the rising air currents you need to form clouds and thunderstorms. So you just get clear skies, intense sun, and very stable dry air.
And the winds pushing moisture away on those western coasts we mentioned?
Correct. The offshore trade winds on the western edges of continents in those subtropical zones, they stop moisture from being carried inland. So that combination, sinking air and offshore winds, it's incredibly effective at keeping things arid.
Makes sense.
And the result of all this is extremely low relative humidity. The source mentions that even in coastal desert areas, relative humidity rarely gets above 50%.
Okay.
But in the vast, hot interiors, it can frequently be less than 10%.
Wow, 10%. And low humidity means water just evaporates almost instantly, right?
It does. Any moisture, whether it's from that scant rain or maybe some groundwater, it's just rapidly sucked up into that incredibly dry air. The source actually describes these conditions as areas of permanent drought, really emphasizing that water scarcity isn't just a seasonal issue, it's the fundamental state of existence there.
Now, you mentioned cold currents playing a role, especially on those western coasts. How does a cold ocean current make it drier? That feels a bit backward. Cold air usually holds less moisture.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah, until you understand the stability it creates.
Stability.
Yeah. So you have these cold ocean currents, like the Californian current, the Peruvian or Humboldt current off Chile and Peru, the Benguela current off southwestern Africa, the West Australian current. They run along these coasts.
Okay.
When moist air from the warmer ocean passes over these cold currents, the very bottom layer of air gets cooled down significantly.
So it gets cold right near the surface.
Yes, but this cold layer near the surface becomes very dense and very stable. And stability is the key here. Stable air just does not want to rise.
I see.
So while the cooling can cause mist and fog right at the coastline, places like Iquique on the Chilean coast are famous for coastal fogs called camanchaca sometimes.
Right. Fog.
This stable, cold air mass effectively puts a cap on the atmosphere just inland.
So it might be foggy right on the beach, but that damp air just won't lift high enough inland to actually form proper rain clouds.
Precisely. That stable layer prevents the convection, the uplift, that you need to build big, rain-producing clouds further inland. So you can have coastal fog, high humidity right at the coast, but just a few miles inland, that stable air mass ensures extreme dryness. Iquique is a perfect example. The source says its annual rainfall is less than half an inch because of the Peruvian current's influence, even though coastal fogs are common.
That's fascinating. A cold current causing fog, but also intense dryness just nearby. And when rain does finally manage to break through all these dry conditions, you said it's often not gentle.
No, generally not. When the atmospheric conditions finally do align, maybe there's a brief period of instability or perhaps some slightly more moist air manages to get in, combined with that intense daytime heating rainfall, often comes as these sudden, violent convectional thunderstorms.
Like just dumping a bucket of water all at once.
Exactly. Intense cloud bursts concentrated over pretty small areas. The rain is heavy, but it's short-lived.
And the ground.
Well, because the ground is often hard-baked, compacted, and dry, very little of that water actually soaks deep into the soil where plants could really use it long term. Most of it just runs off rapidly across the surface.
Causing erosion, I'd imagine.
Yeah, significant erosion. This rapid runoff carves out those wadis or arroyos, the dry riverbeds you see in deserts that only flow for a short time after a rare storm.
Right.
So this characteristic form of precipitation, these intense bursts followed by long, dry periods, means that even when the annual rainfall total might be, say, 5 inches, it's delivered in a way that really minimizes its effectiveness for sustained plant life.
So it's low rainfall, it's unpredictable rainfall, and often it's ineffective rainfall. That's the water story. But deserts are also famous, or infamous, for temperature. Let's talk about those extremes.
Yes, absolutely. While scanty rain defines a desert, extreme temperatures are definitely the other side of the climate coin. Hot deserts are characterized, well, as the name suggests, by very high temperatures, especially during the summer months.
And they hold the world record for heat, don't they?
They do. The highest shade temperature ever reliably recorded on Earth was a scorching 136 degrees F, that's 58 degrees C.
136 Fahrenheit, where was that?
Measured at Al Azizia in Libya in the Sahara Desert way back on September 13th, 1922. Just imagine that heat.
In the shade, too. Unbelievable.
And while the average summer temperature in the Sahara might be around 86 degrees C, 30 degrees C, that average can be misleading.
How so?
Because it includes the cooler nighttime lows and any slightly cooler periods, the maximum daytime temperatures during summer heat waves can easily shoot past 110 degrees F, 43 degrees C, for days or even weeks on end.
And why did it get so incredibly hot?
It really comes down to the lack of moisture and cloud cover. With very dry air, there's hardly any water vapor to absorb the incoming solar radiation. And with no clouds, the sun's energy just blasts the ground directly, heating it intensely and rapidly.
But then, as you mentioned earlier, the nights can get surprisingly cold.
Yes, and this leads to another critical characteristic of desert climates, the extreme diurnal range.
Diurnal range.
That's the difference between the highest temperature reached during the day and the lowest temperature reached at night, all within a 24-hour period. Deserts typically have a very high diurnal range, commonly averaging between 30 degrees and 50 degrees Tier difference.
30 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit swing every day.
Yeah, about 17 degrees C to 28 degrees C difference, commonly. But it can be even larger in some places.
Why such a massive swing from day to night? What causes that?
Again, it's the dry air and the clear skies. During the day, that intense sun heats the ground and the air super quickly. There's very little moisture in the air to sort of absorb and hold on to that heat.
Okay.
Then, at night, with no cloud cover acting like a blanket to trap the heat radiating from the surface, that warmth just escapes very efficiently, very rapidly, back into the atmosphere and out into space. The ground and the air cool down extremely quickly after sunset.
So you can literally go from blistering heat in the afternoon to needing a heavy coat, or even facing freezing temperatures before dawn.
Exactly. The source points to Death Valley, California, which has an average diurnal range of 74 degrees Fahrenheit.
74 degrees Fahrenheit difference in one day.
Yes, 23 Celsius. That's an enormous daily swing. Other examples show this contrast too. Salalah in the Sahara has a hottest month average of 99 degrees F, 37 degrees C, but its coldest month average is down at 55 degrees F, 13 degrees C. That shows a significant difference even month to month, but the daily variation within those months is much, much greater.
Right.
Jacobabad, Pakistan, which is known for intense heat, can see its minimum winter temperatures drop to 41 degrees. 5 degrees C, really illustrating those cold desert nights.
Okay.
But contrast that with Massawa in Ethiopia, right on the Red Sea coast. Its hottest month averages 99 degrees F, 37 degrees C. Coldest month average is still pretty warm at 78 degrees F, 26 degrees C.
So hot year-round, but less swing.
Exactly. It's hot year-round, but being coastal, it's influenced by the sea's moderating effect. It has a much smaller annual temperature range than the interior deserts, even though its daily range is still significant.
Okay, so hot deserts, Huge daily temperature swings are the big story.
Yeah.
What about those mid-latitude deserts we talked about earlier, like the Gobi? How are their temperatures different?
Right. The mid-latitude deserts, like the Gobi or Patagonia, they have a different kind of temperature extreme. While they can have very hot summers, sometimes even hotter than some hot deserts because they're so far inland, away from moderating oceans,
Okay.
they are characterized by a much greater annual range of temperature.
Meaning the difference between the hottest part of summer and the coldest part of winter is massive.
Precisely. Their winters are extremely cold, often dropping well below freezing for long periods. The source specifically points out that snow is common in these mid-latitude deserts during winter.
Snow in a desert. That just completely flips the script on the popular image, doesn't it?
It really does. The example of Kashgar from the Gobi Desert in China illustrates this perfectly. Kashgar has an annual temperature range of about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 44 Celsius.
Wow, 80 degrees Fahrenheit difference across the year.
Yeah, summer highs can get near 80 degrees F, 27 degrees C, but winter lows can plummet to near 0 degrees F and just 18 degrees C, or even colder. That swing of 80 degrees Fahrenheit across the year is far larger than the annual range you typically see in tropical hot deserts.
But the daily swing might be less extreme than, say, the Sahara.
The daily swing in Kashgar is still significant, yeah, but maybe not quite as extreme as in the most intense hot deserts on the hottest days versus coldest nights. It's the annual swing that really defines the mid-latitude desert temperatures.
Okay, so summing that up. Hot deserts equals extreme daily range. Mid-latitude deserts, extreme annual range, with hot summers and very cold, snowy winters. Both present these huge temperature challenges, just in different ways.
Exactly. And we should quickly mention those coastal deserts influenced by cold currents again.
Right, like the Atacama.
Their temperatures are generally lower overall, and they also have smaller annual ranges compared to the interior deserts. The source gives averages like Iquique, Chile at 65 degrees, 18 degrees C annually, and Walvis Bay, Namibia at 66 degrees, 19 degrees. They're definitely dry deserts, but their temperature profile is much more temperate, less extreme than somewhere like the Sahara or the Gobi.
Okay, so we have these places defined by incredibly low, unpredictable rain, and these dramatic temperature swings either daily or annually. How on earth does life, particularly plant life, manage to exist, let alone survive, in such hostile conditions? Seems impossible.
It truly is a testament to the power of adaptation. Plant growth in deserts faces these fundamental severe constraints. The almost complete lack of easily available moisture, the scorching heat and intense sun in hot deserts, and the freezing cold in mid-latitude deserts. It's just an environment that punishes any inefficiency with water.
So the plants have to be tough.
Incredibly tough and specialized. As a result, desert vegetation is usually sparse, scattered, and made up of these highly adapted organisms known as xerophytes.
Xerophytes.
Yeah, drought-resistant plants. You definitely don't see dense forests or lush fields, generally speaking.
Yeah, you don't.
The plants that manage to succeed here have evolved these remarkable strategies to either avoid drought altogether or tolerate it. One of the most obvious strategies is storing water.
Like cacti, right? With their big fleshy stems.
Exactly. Succulents, like cacti or aloes, they've evolved these thick, fleshy stems or leaves that act like reservoirs. They store large amounts of water absorbed during those rare rain events. The source has an image showing Arizona desert plants, like the big saguaro cactus, perfect illustration of these water-storing structures. They also minimize their surface area relative to their volume to cut down on evaporation from their storage tissues.
Makes sense. And minimizing water loss must be just as crucial as storing it in the first place.
Oh, absolutely critical. Desert plants have a whole suite of adaptations to reduce transpiration that's water loss through their leaves. Many modify their leaves into spines or needles.
Like cacti again?
Right. That drastically reduces the surface area exposed to the dry air and sun. Plus, it doubles as defense against animals trying to get at their stored water.
Smart. What else?
Other strategies include developing a thick, waxy, or leathery coating, a cuticle on leaf surfaces to seal moisture in. Having very small leaves helps too. Or having leaves that can curl up or orient themselves vertically to minimize sun exposure during the hottest part of the day. Wow.
Some plants even just shed their leaves entirely during really long droughts.
Yeah.
They basically go dormant until conditions get better.
Just sacrificing the parts that are losing too much water.
Oof, clever. And how do they actually find the water when it does rain or underground?
They've adapted their root systems in amazing ways too. Some plants develop incredibly deep tap roots. These can go down many feet, sometimes even tens of feet, to reach underground water tables. It's like a lifeline to a permanent water source.
Digging deep.
Yeah. Others do the opposite. They have wide-spreading, shallow root systems that fan out just below the surface. This lets them quickly capture and absorb rainwater from those infrequent brief showers before it evaporates or runs off. It's like a race against time and evaporation at the surface.
It sounds like such a harsh existence, just waiting and hoping for water.
hmm
Are there plants that don't even try to live through the dry periods, that just sort of give up and come back later?
Yes, and that's another brilliant strategy. Drought evasion through short life cycles. These are the ephemeral plants, often small herbs or wildflowers.
Ephemeral, meaning short-lived.
Exactly. Their seeds are incredibly tough. They can lie dormant in the desert soil for years, maybe even decades, just waiting.
Waiting for rain.
Waiting for a significant rainfall. When it finally comes, the seeds rapidly sprout. The plants grow incredibly fast, they flower, produce new seeds, and complete their entire life cycle in just a few weeks or months before the soil dries out again.
Wow.
They live intensely and quickly after rain, leaving behind the next generation of dormant seeds to await the next wet period.
That's remarkable. A whole generation packed into just a few weeks, triggered solely by water. So, beyond the famous cacti, what other kinds of plants use these various strategies?
Well, the source mentions various types you'd commonly see, different kinds of grass, hardy shrubs, thorny bushes with those small leaves or spines we talked about, long-rooted, wiry grasses. You also find scattered dwarf acacia trees in some areas, which are adapted to finding deeper moisture. And, of course, the date palm is iconic, but you really only find it in oases, where there's a permanent supply of groundwater near the surface. You don't see date palms scattered across the open desert.
Right, they need that reliable water source.
Exactly. And it's also worth noting that the specific adaptations vary a bit depending on the type of desert. Plants in coastal deserts, which might have higher humidity or get moisture from fog, they might have slightly different strategies than those in the incredibly dry, intensely hot interior deserts. It just highlights how even subtle variations in dryness and temperature shape the specific plant life that can survive.
It's clear that desert plants are absolute masters of survival, just pushing the boundaries of what life can endure through these incredible adaptations. But what about humans? It seems like the most inhospitable environment imaginable for us. Yet people have called deserts home for thousands of years. How do we manage?
That is perhaps the most striking paradox of all, isn't it? Despite the fundamental challenges, the scarcity of water, scarcity of food, the extreme temperatures, the vast distances, humans have shown this incredible capacity for adaptation. We've developed a diverse range of lifestyles to survive and even build societies in desert environments.
But the struggle must always be there.
Oh, the constant struggle for water and food is absolutely central to every facet of desert human life described in the source material. It shapes everything.
The source breaks down the different ways people live in deserts into distinct categories, which is helpful for understanding the range of adaptations I found.
Yes, it does. It categorizes the main types of desert inhabitants into 4 broad groups: primitive hunters and collectors, nomadic herdsmen, caravan traders, and settled cultivators. Each one represents a unique and often very ancient approach to using the limited resources available in different parts of the desert landscape.
Okay, let's start with the most maybe basic lifestyle described, the primitive hunters and collectors. Who are these groups and how do they manage day to day?
The source gives examples like the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa and the Bindibu, or Aborigines, of Australia. These groups maintain a very traditional nomadic way of life. They live directly off whatever the natural desert environment provides. Their existence is often described as a constant struggle, yes, surviving at a very primitive economic level, but crucially, with deep, deep knowledge and skills honed over countless generations.
What kind of skills are essential for their survival? What do they need to know?
Well, they are incredibly skilled hunters and trackers. They use relatively simple tools, bows, poisoned arrows, spears, traps, snares, but they use them with amazing expertise. They can patiently track game over vast distances, understanding animal behavior and movement patterns, especially how they relate to water sources and vegetation.
But hunting can't provide everything, surely.
No, it provides only a portion of their needs. They rely very heavily on gathering. They collect literally anything edible. The desert offers insects, rodents, lizards, bird eggs, wild honey, various roots, grass seeds, grubs, other small creatures. They have an encyclopedic knowledge of what's safe and where to find it.
So they utilize every single potential food source and water.
Yeah.
That ultimate desert challenge. How do they handle that?
Their skills in finding and conserving water are arguably their most crucial adaptation. They know the location of every single water hole within their vast territories, even ones that are temporary or hidden underground. They know how to extract water from certain plant roots, how to collect dew using leaves or animal skins, perhaps, and they're adept at storing and carrying water, maybe in animal skins or hollowed out vessels like ostrich eggshells, which the Bushmen use.
Hmm.
Their life is utterly dependent on these scattered water sources. They live, as the source puts it, in a state of permanent drought. That's their normal, to which they are physiologically and culturally adapted.
And they live in small family groups, right? Which makes sense in an environment with such scarce resources, fewer mouths to feed and water.
Exactly. They typically travel in small, mobile family units, covering large areas to find sufficient resources for that small group. The source describes the Bindibu traveling in these small groups, seeking shelter in natural hollows or behind bushes, using fire not just for cooking, but critically for warmth during the cold desert nights. It highlights the importance of temperature management, even for these groups.
Right. Those cold nights.
They're often described as lean and healthy, physically adapted to the demands of their environment, and they possess essential skills like fire making from scratch and building simple temporary shelters from whatever is available.
Okay. Moving on to the next group, the nomadic herdsmen. They seem to have a different relationship with the environment, one based on domesticated animals.
Yes, this group represents a more, let's say, advanced economic strategy. It's a pastoral economy based on raising livestock that are themselves adapted to the desert or the semi-arid fringes. Instead of just taking what nature provides day to day, they rely on managing animals.
What kind of animals can actually survive in these harsh conditions alongside people?
Well, it varies quite a bit by region and the specific environmental conditions. The most iconic, of course, is the camel, raised by groups like the Tuaregs in the Sahara and the Bedouin Arabs in the Arabian Desert, often alongside hardier animals like goats.
Okay.
But then in the colder mid-latitude deserts, like the Gobi, you find groups like the Mongols raising horses and yaks animals suited to the high plateau in those cold winters.
And their life is just one of constant movement with their herds, right? Following the food and water for the animals.
Precisely. Their entire livelihood is mobile. They travel light, following traditional seasonal routes. These are established migration paths that take them to areas where pasture and water are available at different times of the year. They live in portable dwellings, like the famous yurts, those round felt tents used by the Mongols, which can be quickly taken down, packed onto animals, and put up again at the next camp.
It's an economy built entirely on mobility and the animals. Do they interact with other groups? Do they trade?
Yes, absolutely. They often engage in vital trade with settled agricultural communities or oasis dwellers, usually found at the edges of the desert. They exchange the products of their herds, things like hides, wool, milk, cheese, sometimes meat or live animals for essentials they can't produce themselves, like grains, dates, manufactured goods, tools, textiles.
So the animals are basically their wealth, their food source, and their transport. Everything rolled into one.
Fundamentally, yes. Their animals are the absolute basis of their economy and survival. They provide sustenance, milk, cheese, sometimes meat, materials, skins for clothing, footwear, water bags, wool for tents, bedding, carpets, and they are essential for transportation, allowing them to move their camps and carry goods for trade. The source mentions the Bedouin following regular trade routes, exchanging a variety of goods including dates, grain, and even things like medicines and firearms at trading stations and oases. It shows they were integrated into wider economic networks, not totally isolated.
That connection through trade directly leads into the third group the source discusses, the caravan traders. They weren't necessarily living in the desert permanently, but used it more like a highway, right?
Exactly. Caravan trading was historically a crucial economic activity. They used the deserts as transit routes to connect distant civilizations and regions, long before modern transportation existed. These were the arteries of ancient and medieval global trade in many parts of the world.
What were some of the major routes mentioned?
The source highlights the famous trans-Saharan routes, which connected the Mediterranean coast of North Africa with the kingdoms down in West Africa, south of the desert, and also the routes crossing the deserts of Central Asia, linking East Asia with the Middle East and Europe, parts of the legendary Silk Road network.
And these journeys sound incredibly long and difficult.
Oh, they were epic undertakings, often taking months, sometimes even years, for a round trip covering thousands of miles of incredibly harsh and dangerous terrain.
Dangerous not just from the environment, but from bandits too, I assume.
Yes, banditry was a constant threat, alongside all the natural hazards of the desert: getting lost, running out of water, sandstorms, the extreme heat or cold depending on the desert and season. Because of these risks, traders traveled in large, organized, and often well-armed groups called caravans for mutual protection. These weren't small ventures. A major caravan could involve hundreds, maybe even thousands of camels and people.
Wow, what kind of goods were actually worth risking such a perilous journey?
A huge variety, really, depending on the specific route and the regions connected. Goods moving from the remote interior could include things like hides, furs, carpets, rugs, precious stones, ivory sometimes, and critically, gold from West Africa coming north across the Sahara.
Oh, right.
And then from the more developed market towns at the edges or beyond, goods like silk from China, other manufactured items, spices, and salt were transported into the interior or across continents. Salt was a hugely important trade commodity in the Sahara, often worth its weight in other goods in areas where it was scarce.
High risk, high reward. It definitely sounds like it. And this whole system was only really made possible by one specific animal, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The camel. It truly earned its nickname, the ship of the desert, because it was just uniquely adapted to this environment in a way no other pack animal really was. Camels are incredibly strong. They're capable of carrying heavy loads, the source says, or around 350 pounds or 160 kilograms for long distances, typically covering about 50 miles or 80 kilometers per day.
And their famous ability to go without water.
That was crucial. Camels can store significant amounts of water internally, not in their hump, that's fat storage, but they have physiological mechanisms to minimize water loss through urine and sweat. This allows them to travel for many days, sometimes over a week or even longer depending on the heat, and if they can browse on some vegetation along the way without needing to drink.
Amazing.
Plus, their broad, padded feet are adapted for walking on sand without sinking too much. They can close their nostrils during sandstorms, and they can tolerate pretty extreme body temperature fluctuations. Without the camel, large-scale desert caravan trades simply wouldn't have been possible.
But this historic way of life, these massive caravans, they've largely faded now, haven't they?
Significantly, yes. The role of traditional camel caravans has dramatically declined with the arrival of modern transportation infrastructure. The construction of roads, railways, and especially the development of air travel allow goods to be moved much, much faster, more cheaply, and in vastly larger volumes than is possible with caravans.
So technology just made them obsolete for large-scale trade.
Pretty much. While small-scale, local camel transport still exists in some very remote areas, the era of the great trans-desert caravans as major arteries of global trade is largely over. They've been replaced by trucks, trains, and cargo planes.
A whole economic and cultural system superseded by technology.
Okay, finally, the fourth group mentioned, the settled cultivators. This seems like the most challenging lifestyle of all in a desert. Farming needs water, and deserts are defined by a lack of water. How does that work?
It is a stark contrast to the mobile lifestyles of the other groups, for sure. Settled cultivation, building permanent homes, and farming the same land year after year is only viable in very specific desert locations where there is a reliable and sufficient source of water for irrigation.
So not just anywhere in the desert.
Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
This means either at oases where natural springs or accessible groundwater allows farming on a relatively smaller scale, or, much more significantly, along the valleys of major rivers that happen to flow through the desert, bringing water from moister regions far away. And the prime, classic, historic example everyone thinks of is the Nile Valley in Egypt.
The Nile Valley is the absolute quintessential example, yes. It shows how a major river can support large-scale, settled agriculture in an otherwise completely arid environment. It demonstrates the power of irrigation to fundamentally transform a narrow strip of desert into this fertile lifeline supporting millions of people for millennia.
And this isn't a recent thing. Farming has been going on there for thousands of years.
Absolutely. The ancient Egyptians were masters of desert agriculture. They developed sophisticated systems as early as 5,000 years ago. Their entire magnificent civilization was essentially built upon utilizing the annual natural flood cycle of the Nile River to grow crops. This reliable food surplus was the foundation that allowed for the development of complex social structures, monumental architecture, writing, everything.
How did that ancient system actually work? Before dams?
Their main method was what's called basin irrigation. Before the big dams were built, the Nile would flood its banks naturally every year, depositing fertile silt and covering the surrounding fields with water. The Egyptians would build these earth embankments to create large basins, trapping the floodwaters as the river level went down.
Okay.
The water would then soak into the soil in these basins, and the fertile silt would enrich it. Once the water had soaked in or evaporated enough, they would plant their crops in the moist, fertile ground, relying entirely on that one annual inundation to see them through the growing season.
Clever use of the natural cycle. And how has that system evolved in more modern times?
Well, modern development has shifted to perennial irrigation. This relies on the construction of major barrages and large dams, most famously the High Aswan Dam in Egypt, but also others like the Sennar Dam on the Blue Nile in Sudan. These huge structures regulate the river's flow completely. They store vast quantities of water in reservoirs behind them.
Like Lake Nasser.
Exactly. And this allows water to be released in a controlled way and distributed through extensive canal networks for irrigation all year round, not just relying on the timing of the natural flood season.
So this allows for multiple harvests a year, not just one.
Exactly. Perennial irrigation enables farmers to cultivate the land continuously and grow multiple crops annually. While traditional crops included things like wheat, barley, and beans, modern agriculture in these irrigated desert valleys now includes very water-intensive cash crops like cotton, sugarcane, and rice crops that would be completely impossible without that constant managed supply of river water. And it's worth noting, this settled life requires a completely different social organization compared to the mobile groups. It demands a structured society to manage the complex irrigation systems, organize the labor needed for building and maintaining canals and dams, and deal with issues like land ownership and water distribution. It's a far cry from the loosely organized hunting bands or the migrating pastoralists. It's a way of life that relies on intensive human intervention and modification of the environment, really only possible where the desert is crossed by a major river or blessed with significant natural oases.
It is truly incredible, though, to see that whole spectrum of human adaptation learn out, from, tracking lizards for a drop of water, all the way to building monumental dams to reshape a river flowing through a vast desert. It just makes you realize that even in the most seemingly barren, impossible places, human ingenuity somehow finds a way.
That's really what stands out when you connect all these pieces, doesn't it? The fundamental, often brutal constraints of the desert environment, that minimal, unpredictable rainfall, the intense daily or annual temperature swings, they don't just dictate where deserts happen to be on the map, they directly shape absolutely everything that lives there.
Yeah.
From the ingenious ways plants store water or just lie dormant for years waiting for rain, to the diverse, often centuries-old strategies that humans have developed.
And reconsidering that distinction between hot and mid-latitude deserts feels important here, too. It's not just a geographical label. The difference in whether you face extreme daily heat swings or extreme annual heat to freezing swings creates really distinct survival challenges. And those require different sets of adaptations for both the plants and the animals and the people living there.
It really raises this important question about resilience, doesn't it? How have people not just scraped by, but actually built cultures, extensive trade networks, even entire civilizations in places defined by what they lack? It speaks to such a deep understanding of the local environment, a remarkable ability to innovate, whether that's tracking skills, animal husbandry, or complex water engineering, and often really strong community ties that are essential for mutual support in such a difficult landscape.
It really challenges that initial image we talked about, the desert. It's just empty, lifeless sand. It's clearly a dynamic ecosystem, maybe a fragile one in many ways, but populated by life forms that have evolved under intense pressure. And that pressure has led to some truly remarkable and fascinating adaptations.
Yeah, thinking of the desert as just an empty wasteland completely misses the incredible story of life, pushing the absolute boundaries of possibility.
So we've taken this deep dive, journeying across the globe to understand where deserts are found. We've explored the intense realities of their climates, the dryness, the heat, the cold. We've marveled at the extraordinary adaptations of desert plants.
The xerophytes, yeah.
And we've discovered the incredible ingenuity and the diverse strategies humans have developed to make a home in these challenging places. From those nomadic hunters all the way to the settled farmers along life-giving rivers.
Hopefully, this discussion has given you, the listener, a much clearer, maybe richer understanding of these remarkable environments, moving beyond the simple stereotype and providing you with some lasting aha moments, perhaps, and some vivid details about places like the Atacama, the Sahara, the Gobi, and the incredibly resilient life they support.
It's a lot to process, definitely. From, world record-breaking heat to ancient irrigation techniques that built civilizations. But if we just step back for a final moment,
Maybe consider how these ancient strategies for survival that we've discussed, this deep understanding of resource conservation, this profound connection to and knowledge of the local environment, this reliance on community for survival. Maybe how they might hold valuable lessons for modern life, even for those of us living far, far away from the desert sands. Lessons perhaps about resilience, resourcefulness, maybe living in better balance with our own environments. What aspect of these desert stories, these adaptations, stands out to you the most now, thinking back on it?